I'm here today as General Meade, George G. Meade. And so all of my comments are based on my experiences, my writings, my service, my career. Perhaps not everyone will agree with me, but this is from my perspective. And obviously, all of us had opponents, rivals, sycophants, you name it. But I assure you that everything that I tell you today is coming out of my experiences in that very tragic but thrilling age of the Civil War, the War of the Rebellion. I did speak to you, as I mentioned before, of my career, my life, up to and including the Battle of Gettysburg. So I'm not going to get into that in detail unless there are questions. But on that very exciting and pivotal date, I came into historical perspective and view based on receiving an order to take command of the Field Army of the Potomac at the very, very outset of the Gettysburg campaign. I was actually promoted from 5th Corps Command to command of the Army 3 days before the battle erupted on July the 1st, 1863, in my home state, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And I was thrust into the spotlight. I did not ask for the command. I did not solicit the command. I was ordered to assume command in the most critical phase of American history up to that point, because on the next action, on the next battle, of course, hung the future of the nation. Would it remain united, firm and strong into the future, or would it be divided somehow into two countries or some sort of sovereignty for the Confederacy, which would have been, of course, disastrous. So fortunately, I rose to the occasion. I won't get into that again because I did speak about the battle. And I was able to repulse my old comrade from the old Army, Robert E. Lee. We had known each other well. We were both engineers. We had actually served together. We shared a tent together in Mexico. So we knew each other. We had gone to each other's soirees and parties in Washington. We moved in the same social circles, so we knew each other well. But I was able to repulse all his attacks and drive him back into the Confederacy. And so what I wanted to talk about and begin today is General Meade after the Battle of Gettysburg, which is considerable. So I will try to limit my remarks. I was asked by Mike Somerville how long I wanted to go, and I said, well, 8 hours would probably be sufficient to get across all my messages. But he just smiled, a gentlemanly smile, and of course I said, well, all right, maybe not 8. So it's going to be an hour, and then Q&A, questions and answers to follow. So a lot of this is going to be an overview because each campaign merits its own discussion and its own presentation, but we obviously don't have time to do that. But I will focus, of course, on my role as the Major General commanding the Army of the Potomac, and I will remain in command of that army until the very end of the war. So I was not displaced. I was not sacked or anything else, and in fact remained in command. But what happened to me? Why am I not on a $50 bill? Well, it turns out that the man who is on the $50 US bill is the man who I did everything to put there, Ulysses S. Grant. And that's because he was promoted in March of 1864 to the highest ranking position in the United States Army, specially created for him the office, the rank of Lieutenant General, which meant that he ranked every other soldier in the United States Army, including all the major generals, and therefore was in total command of the Army, the General-in-Chief. And he chose to place his headquarters in the field with me. When he visited me at Culpeper Courthouse on March the 10th, 1864. I had an inkling that he wanted to take over. I mean, he's a field commander. He had much success in the West. A younger man, I knew him slightly in Mexico. He was a quartermaster. They don't have a good reputation in the Army. I don't want to get into that. And I know he had irregular personal habits, which forced him to resign his commission before the Civil War. He did return, of course, to command a regiment and then moved up in command in the West, where he had a great success, which is the mark of a great leader. And I'm perfectly subordinate, and I'm not going to play General Hooker and write letters behind his back and contact political supporters and complain and so on. I don't do that. I obey orders. But I did receive him cordially in my tent, and I tried to put him at ease and told him, first of all, I congratulated him on his promotion and on his great success they had in the West. And then I said, listen, General Grant, you can replace me. It will not ruin, it will not insult me. I will hold your horse if I have to. I will go anywhere and do the best of my ability and duty, but please feel free. You won't hurt my feelings if you want to bring in some other commander. And he was taken aback, and he was kind of amazed somewhat. I guess that's a very rare quality in his mind anyway, for officers in the Army at that time, maybe forever. But he said, oh, no, I admire your great victory at Gettysburg. The Army respects you. No, I want you to stay. And so I accepted and thanked him. And but he said, but I'm going to let you know now that I am not going to command from Washington. I'm going to be in the field. I'm a field combat soldier, and therefore I'm going to place my headquarters in the field with you, because my plan of attack and of policy, military policy and strategy is Lee and his army are your targets, and that you will follow him and pursue him to the ends of the earth. And that is our strategy and plan. If Lee and his army are defeated, then the other armies in the field will follow like dominoes going down sequentially. So I realized then that I will continue in command of the Army of the Potomac, but I'm really not in command, because my boss, his tent is next to mine. And every morning when I get up and come out to the fire to get a cup of coffee, he's sitting there whittling. And therefore, as General, good morning, I hope you're well. What's the plan for today? So I'm essentially second in command, or the executive officer, which I found fine. It's not about my reputation. It's not about my ego. It's about the cause. And I always kept that in mind. The cause was the most important thing, and that whatever I had to do to achieve victory would be done. So let me go back to the period after Gettysburg. This would be July 4th, starting July 4th, 1863. Maybe some of you are interested to know what I did after the battle, immediately after the Battle of Gettysburg, the pursuit of Lee and his army, and his retreat. So it's Lee's retreat, Meade's pursuit. And I won't go into all great depth and detail, because that's another talk. But what I did do is, of course, on July the 4th, there was a huge torrential downpour the whole day. And you couldn't maneuver, you couldn't even see. And the battlefield became a quagmire. Many of the wounded who were laying out near water sources actually drowned because of being out in that torrential rain, and the creeks overflowed and so on. Under the cover of that rainstorm, General Lee began his retreat through the three principal passes to the South Mountain Range, which was to his rear. And that was Cashtown and I have them written down somewhere. Cashtown, of course, being the most northerly, and then Monterey Pass is another, and then Fairfield Pass behind the little village of Fairfield, where there was a skirmish and a kind of a cavalry action with the 6th Corps against the rear guard of Lee's army as he retreated. So finally, July the 5th dawns, and I realized from reports and in reconnaissance and so on that Lee was indeed retreating. Now, you could never be sure of Lee retreating. It seems that almost every battle, when he started to retreat, it was really a flank march to get into your flank and rear. Consider, of course, Chancellorsville for that. Everybody felt that he was retreating to Richmond, and Hooker was happy, and everybody was elated, and they became complacent. And all of a sudden, 2/3 of his army showed up on the right flank of our Union Army, and under General Stonewall Jackson, of course, and drove us back almost back to Washington. And it was one of our greatest, most miserable defeats at Chancellorsville. So you couldn't rely on that being being a feint. And so I had to wait and find out for sure that Lee was indeed going back through the passes, back into the Cumberland Valley, and then eventually to the Shenandoah Valley and the safety of Virginia. I ascertained that that was the case, and so late on the July the 5th and into July the 6th, I began preparations to follow up Lee by sending the 6th Corps behind him and pressing him through the passes. But these passes were very narrow, they were very rocky, they were high. So we couldn't really expect a battle there. It would be on Lee's terms. So it was more or less just to press him in his retreat. But I realized that the only way to get and block Lee's crossing of the Potomac was to march south and then over the Blue Ridge and Catoctin, and then up to Williamsport, Maryland on the Potomac that way. Now, Lee had only 40 miles to march to get to the crossings at Williamsport and Hagerstown. I, on the other hand, had 80 miles to march the long way around over 2 mountain chains and to get my army in position to block his retreat. Of course, I did send the cavalry out on escapades, and there were major cavalry battles. The Battle of Monterey Pass involved 10,000 cavalry, and it was a victory for the Union. And no one really knows much about that, but it actually did happen. And then a battle in Hagerstown, again, primarily a Union victory, and so on. And of course, we did harass Lee as he did retreat, but he eventually did get to the Potomac, but he couldn't cross. And the reason was that the rains that had come about after the battle caused the river to rise to the point where they couldn't wade it anymore. And he didn't have a pontoon bridge, so he had to dig in. Well, he found a wonderful defensive position called the Downsville Line, with anchoring both flanks on the Potomac, with good high positions in front. And he sat there for several days, rested his men. He couldn't get supplies across from the Virginia side via barges and things like that. And therefore he was well supplied. And he invited me to attack him there at Hagerstown, or the Downsville Line, if you will. Downsville in the north, and the Potomac on his right. So when I did finally arrive with my army late on the 12th of July, I couldn't send my troops in willy-nilly without preparation, without reconnaissance and so on. That would be suicide. I have always been against suicide charges. I participated in them myself. They never work. Infantry or cavalry charges against entrenched infantry, they just don't work. And so I had a council, if you want to call it a meeting, a chalk talk, whatever you want to call it, with my commanders. Those are the men who would command the troops that I would send into action. And I wanted their opinion. And to a man, they all said, no, we are not ready to attack yet. Not all our troops are up. They're exhausted. Some of them marched out of their shoes. We needed supplies, ammunition, and so on. And some of them were brand new commanders because we had lost some very, very good men, including General Hancock. General Sickles was a good thing, so that probably was productive. But we also lost General Reynolds, of course, my very, very dear and close friend and best commander in the Army, troop commander. So I decided that I would take the next day, July 13th, to do a reconnaissance of Lee's line. Now, I'm an engineer. You know that from the last talk. I know ground. I was a topographical engineer. I know maps and charts, and I know heights and those kinds of things. I know all about that, how many men it takes to fill a line and so on, and to recognize weak positions and strong positions and so on. And so I took my engineers and we rode the lines and we found a weak spot at near Hagerstown, at Funkstown, where the line bent somewhat and there was not quite as much protection for the enemy. And therefore I ordered up the army the next day, July 14th. By the way, that was a bad day for the kings of France, and it was a bad day for General Meade as well, because when we did advance at dawn, the troops marched across the ground, and when they got to Lee's lines, they were vacated, empty. He had retreated. Some would say skedaddled back across the Potomac. Several things had happened. First of all, he assumed what I was doing. He knew what I was doing. He ascertained that I was ready to come at him and that in a superior position, and therefore he realized that it was going to be unsuccessful, and therefore he spent a whole evening, a whole night, tearing down local barns to create a bridge across the Potomac, which had fallen somewhat enough to allow the army to cross and in safety. He did leave behind a force of about 2,000 men under the command of General Pettigrew from North Carolina. And that was the rear guard to give them time to the Confederate Army of the Northern Virginia to continue their retreat. Well, I attacked that force, and we killed or captured all of those men, and also killed, mortally wounded, General Pettigrew. So there was some success there. Now, did Lee escape into Virginia? The safety of it? Yes, he did. But I was severely criticized for that. I did my duty. I felt it was the best plan. I was completely satisfied that I had done the right thing, but the result came out differently than I thought. That happens in war, in all kinds of plans. There's always a chance that things won't work out the way you wanted them to. And of course, that motivated much criticism in Washington. General Halleck, who really knew nothing except the manual, and Abraham Lincoln, the president, whom I respected as a politician, but was no military man. And of course, he was snug as a bug in a rug in his room in the White House, decided that I had failed in my duty. And so I received a telegram from General Halleck saying that the president was dissatisfied that I had allowed Lee to, imagine that, allowed him, as if I had sent him an invitation, to retreat across the Potomac into safety. And since the president felt that I had not measured up to his expectations, I felt there was only one thing to do, and that is to offer my resignation. Obviously, he had no faith in my command. Remember, I had been ordered to assume command. I was under no obligation to continue if I hadn't met the sanguine expectations of the president, and therefore I telegraphed back to General Halleck and said that I would resign. So, almost immediately, a couple of hours later, I received another telegram from Halleck, and Halleck apologized and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The president wasn't dissatisfied. He was just disappointed that Lee had escaped." Well, hell, I was disappointed too. So that was okay. So I withdrew my resignation. So I did continue in position of commander of the Army of the Potomac. So General Lee is on the Virginia side of the Potomac. I am on the Maryland side of the Potomac, and I do attempt to block him again in the Shenandoah Valley. I won't give you all the details, but I did have some new troops, reinforcements that arrived, General French, which joined the 3rd Corps, and I did, along with the help of my new Chief of Staff, General Humphreys, the best engineer in the Army, better than me, a fellow Philadelphian, we devised a plan to catch Lee near Front Royal and to give him battle there. In other words, force him to give us battle because we would be blocking his way south towards Richmond. And because of some poor leadership on the part of some of my commanders, and I'm not casting blame, I guess maybe I am in a sense, but they failed to live up to the timetable and the plan and so on. I hope to give him a battle at Wapping Heights, which is near Winchester and Front Royal in the Shenandoah Valley. Wapping Heights, July 25th, 1863. But because the reinforcements that I expected were not there, I was forced to cancel the attack because I just wasn't prepared there. And so it allowed Lee to continue his retreat south and then over the Blue Ridge back into central Virginia and into the Fredericksburg area in close proximity to Richmond, where he could receive supplies via railroads and so on. So what happens then, of course, is we continued our advance through central Virginia and reached Culpeper Courthouse. We went into camp there, and because we were exhausted, there were draft riots going on in New York. I was ordered to send 10,000 troops to help put down the draft riots in New York and elsewhere. So I was depleted of troops. The men were exhausted. I needed new commanders. I mean, it was just I needed rest and recovery. And so we went into camp, and General Lee decided that he was going to try another maneuver on me. And he wanted to do to me what he did to General Pope in 1862, in the summer of 1862, and that is to make a giant flank attack and drive him into battle, or drive me into battle, and then defeat me there at Bull Run. It would be a third battle of Bull Run. Now, I wasn't at the first battle of Bull Run, but my horse was. Oh, Baldy, long story. I was at the second battle of Bull Run. And of course, that was a disastrous enterprise as well. And what happened, I now knew what he was doing. And so he began to try to turn my right flank. And since you're on the open plains there in northern Virginia, we had to fall back to the heights at Centerville. And I was able to do that. Now, I wasn't driven back like Pope was. I retired to those heights. It's not a retreat, it's a withdrawal. So I withdrew the army to a superior position where I was completely safe, and Lee had no chance to turn my flanks. What he did do then, he tried to come onto my left flank, and we caught him at Bristow Station and slaughtered an entire division of A.P. Hill's corps there. So if you have a third Battle of Bull Run, I won that battle under General Warren commanding our Second Corps. They hid behind a railroad embankment, and as the Confederates started to march by, they rose up and fired into their flank, and thousands fell at the Bristow Station. I don't know if you've ever heard of that action. but it was a great action and prevented another Confederate victory, potentially. And of course, it was a great victory for our army. Now, did I receive the accolades? Not really, but I don't care, because we were able to defeat Lee's plan, and Lee was forced to retire back behind the safety of the Rappahannock River. So this is October, of course, mid-October of 1863. I follow up. We're at Culpeper Courthouse. I devise a plan to turn Lee's right flank. He actually went into a camp on the head wilderness today, the Wilderness Battle, which will eventually be the Wilderness. And that's where he was wintering. So I wanted to turn his right flank, and if I would turn his right flank, I would position my army between him and Richmond and his supplies, and he would be forced to come out on ground favorable to our army, and I had a much better chance of defeating Lee there. And this will become the Mine Run campaign. Unfortunately, it's an abortive campaign. Again, it was complicated at the end of November, early December, 1863. The weather did not cooperate, and some of my commanders could not keep up with the timetables and their assignments and so on. They failed. Finally, I did order a grand assault on Lee's lines at Mine Run, and General Warren, in whom I had confidence, he had been a great engineer, I placed the majority of the action, telling him that once his guns opened and he advanced, then the rest of the army would follow. Well, this is early December 1863. On that morning, he looked out with his binoculars and saw Lee's works, and on his own accord and of his own free will, he canceled the attack. Of course, he neglected to tell me about that. And so everyone is waiting for his guns to fire. There's no firing. Nobody's advancing. Nothing's going on. I had to write out to see General Warren, and what's going on? And he said, I'm not attacking that. It's a slaughter. It will be a suicide charge. And I know about those because I've been in them. And I looked at it and I said, you're right. And so I sustained him in that decision, even though a lot of generals would not have done that. I'm not casting aspersions, but you know what I'm talking about. And so we canceled the attack, and it looked like that I had goofed, so to speak. I made a great error in judgment and command. I was ready to be relieved at that point, but I called back my troops. We withdrew back to Culpeper Courthouse and into our safety of our winter camps. And I did receive a lot of criticism, but it was somewhat muted because of the weather at the time, and so on and so forth. So that's where the Army of the Potomac will spend the winter of 1863-64. Of course, a lot of things are happening politically. General Grant is going to be promoted to lieutenant general. He's going to come from Chattanooga, where he had commanded in the West. And, I mentioned that already. Of course, there's the abortive Dahlgren raid, Kilpatrick Dahlgren raid of late February, early March 1864, where Kilpatrick and his assistant, Colonel Dahlgren, who's a Philadelphian, by the way, his father, Admiral John Dahlgren, is a Philadelphian. They're both buried in Philadelphia in the same cemetery where I'm buried, Laurel Hill Cemetery, about 50 yards away from me. So I know them well. We're fellow landholders there, I guess you could say. Without my knowledge nor a consultation, they went directly to Edwin Stanton and worked out this deal to try to ride into Richmond and relieve the prisoners of war at Belle Isle and at Libby Prison, and perhaps do some mayhem in the city and burn some supplies. And then there was a kind of a political consequence as well, because there was some action, some suggestion that they might try to capture Jefferson Davis and his cabinet and hang them from a sour apple tree if they could find one, and or burn the city of Richmond. Well, this was a complete disaster. Nothing worked. Dahlgren got separated from the main body and ran into an ambush. He was killed, 5 bullets outright from his saddle, and on his body they found papers indicating that what he was intending to do was to burn the city and hang Jefferson Davis. So there was a great political scandal. I was involved. Didn't you know about this? Did you order this? Even General Lee wrote me a letter and said it through the lines, what role did you play in this? And so on. A haughty, arrogant guy. I thought we had been friends. Anyway, I played no role in that, other than I was told that this was going to happen. This was a political decision. So that was quite a disaster, and was in the press around the same time that General Grant is going to be coming down. So let's put it this way. General Grant does come. We have a cordial meeting. We agree to work together. He is going to come down and places with me. I've been called back to Washington on a couple of occasions to testify before the witch hunt. There's a witch hunt committee in Washington composed of senators and congressmen called the Committee on the Conduct of the War. Essentially, it was a political witch hunt trying to put blame and to eliminate those commanders whom they did not like for political reasons, and to install those they did like. And probably one of the weakest things that Abraham Lincoln did was allow this committee to continue the work, because, well, they kept saying, oh, we're only writing a history of the war, and we want personal first-person testimony on your roles and so on. But the consequences were very dire. And so I was called before the committee. Well, let me tell you a really brief story. I was called to the White House to confer with General Halleck and President Lincoln on March the 4th, March the 5th, something like that. So there was nothing about testimony, appearing before the committee. I was just supposed to go up and consult. And so I rode up on the train, and I walked into the office of the General-in-Chief. At that time, it was still Halleck. And one of the clerks looked at me and said, oh, General, are you here to testify before the committee? And I said, what? What committee? What testify? What testimony? I knew nothing about it. I wasn't informed. I had no notes. I hadn't prepared. So I rode over to the committee room immediately to find out what was going on. And there were one or two members of the committee, and not the whole committee. Apparently they had been warned that I was coming over, and I was really angry. And you know the Meade temper, everybody knows about that. And I said, what's this testimony? What's going on? I don't have any notes. I haven't prepared. Is this a witch hunt, etc.? And they said, no, we're doing a history of the war, etc., etc. So I sat down and gave my take on the whole. I had written a very detailed report of the battle and campaign. Apparently they had not read that. I'm not sure. So they said, well, thank you very much for that. We appreciate it. And I left. But apparently there were, they all called other witnesses, commanders in my army, and I didn't even know that they were there. For example, General Howe testified against me, Butterfield, and also, of course, Sickles. And I'm trying to think who else. Doubleday. Has an intense hatred for me for many reasons I won't get into. He did not invent baseball, by the way. So I went back, and of course we began to have plans, what we're going to do in the spring when the roads hardened and we had good supply built up and so on and so forth. And what will develop will be what will become known as the Virginia Overland Campaign of 1864. And this will be the attempt by my army to drive south and taking on General Lee and his army at every opportunity. That's the major thing, not to gain ground, not to capture towns and cities, but really to tripped the enemy army. So it was kind of a war of attrition in a sense. And so I won't go into all the details. I'm sure you're familiar with them. It was a very awkward command structure that Grant had established. Our army was reduced to 3 corps from 7 corps. We had sent 2 corps west to help Sherman in Chattanooga. The 11th Corps and the 12th Corps, they were gone. The 3rd Corps, the 1st Corps, and the 5th Corps, the 11th Corps, sorry, wait a minute, let me get this right. 1st Corps, 3rd Corps were dissolved, and the units were transferred into the remaining 3 corps, 2nd Corps, 5th Corps, and 6th Corps. And then the 9th Corps under Burnside came up, but it had, because Burnside ranked me, that he was given an independent command, just kind of under the command of Grant. So I couldn't send any orders directly to Burnside. I had to go through Grant. It was a very awkward situation, but he was trying to play politics, I guess, and Army politics primarily. So we crossed the Rapidan and the Rappahannock and started to move down through the wilderness of the same essential plan that we had in May of '63 with the wilderness and at Chancellorsville, of course. And unfortunately, on May the 5th, 1864, the men bedded down in the wilderness among the skulls and skeletons and equipment of their comrades from 1 year before, who had been killed in the battle and never been buried. It was horrible. Can you imagine the men going into battle and action and resting among the skeletons of the dead on the field, many of whom had burned in the fires that followed the Battle of the Wilderness. And actually, some of them identified comrades from their uniforms or from bits of equipment and names on knapsacks and things like that. Very, very horrible thing. 2-day battle, May 5th, May 6th, 1864. The Wilderness is somewhat of a stalemate, but General Grant decided that we would continue to move by our left flank to try to outflank Lee on his right. And then we would move south and try to draw Lee again out into action in the open where we would have the advantage. We had a much larger army. We had more guns, better supplies, an unlimited supply of reinforcements and so on, which Lee really did not. And so the rest of the campaign, Spotsylvania, the crossing of the Pamunkey down to Cold Harbor. Of course, Cold Harbor turned out to be a suicide charge, June 4th, 1864. And General Grant and his staff more and more took over duties that normally I would have with my army, since I was in command of the main force, the Army of the Potomac. Although I did receive reinforcements from the Army of the James, and of course Burnside was there. He was always late. Eventually, Grant got so upset with him that he said, "No, now you're under Meade's command. Forget rank and so on." And so the 9th Corps came under my command as well. But he came to me and he said, "No, I want to attack their works." I said, "They're entrenched. It's very solid. It's open ground. And this is a suicide charge." He said, "No, I don't care. I think we can break them here." And so the terrible decision to charge at Cold Harbor cost 7,000 casualties in 20 minutes. And even in Grant's memoirs and so on, he talks about that's one of the worst mistakes he ever made and regretted every day. So I was right, he was wrong, but he was my commander, and we lost a lot of men unnecessarily. I was always in favor of try to maneuver the enemy into a bad position where we could take necessary steps. So eventually we have to decide what are we going to do now. And so in consultation with me, remember, I'm the engineer, he's not. He's the old quartermaster. We devised a plan to take our army across the James. Now, the James River, below Richmond is 1 mile wide, 1 mile. So there are no pontoon bridges that go 1 mile across a river. So we had to come up with a plan. I was part of that plan, did most of the planning with my engineers, and we brought up riverboats, and the pontoons went from riverboat to riverboat until they got across the James. And we eventually, on June the 16th, crossed the entire Second Corps without Lee even knowing about it. So we had stolen a march on General Lee, and we were in south of the James in the Petersburg area, ready to attack Petersburg. And should we take Petersburg, cut off all the railroads that came in from the south and the west, then Richmond would be starved. Lee would have to come out and fight us in order to maintain his campaign and his army. And so that's what brought on the siege of Petersburg. Unfortunately, coordination between the Army of the James, which is Benjamin Butler at this time, and my own army was imperfect. Too many chains of command to go through, not enough preparation, orders were delayed, supplies did not arrive when they were supposed to, and so on. It's the fog of war, and that happens. I realize that. I'm not going to deny I may have had some responsibility, but again, I was working under this very burdensome situation with the command structure, with everything having to go through General Grant. So what we'll do is we will create a series of battles trying to drive the Confederates back from their lines outside of Petersburg. And they had the Dimmock line, a very, very fine engineering project that they had done years before. And they fell back from one fortified position to another. And so we weren't able to break right through. We drove them back. But as they got further close to the town, they got closer to their supplies and reinforcements. So in a way, it was kind of an advantage to them. They lost territory. And so we will now enter into what's just called a siege, a 9 to 10 month siege, the siege of Petersburg, where the Army of the Potomac, the Army of the James will cooperate and try to shorten the lines by moving always towards the left, sometimes to the right, to draw Lee and reinforcements away from their defenses, where we could find a weak spot and break through. And so this is very, very long and very, very tedious discussion. I won't go into all the details, but during this time, there are many, many almost constant battles. There's trench warfare in its infancy. And eventually Lee has some success. We had some success. We had a great disaster known as the mine explosion. That was on July 30th, 1864, where the coal miners from Pennsylvania, the 48th Pennsylvania Regiment, under their Colonel Pleasance, who was a mining engineer, suggested that they dig a mine. Now, mines are not new. This goes back to ancient times, mining under the works and so on. But they decided they would build this long tunnel over 500 feet long, which was unprecedented. They were able to ventilate it, and even though the enemy knew something was going on, they couldn't stop it. And then they packed 4,000 pounds of black powder in the shaft, and then they were going to blow it and blow a big hole in the works at Elliott's salient. And was a problem because General Burnside's 9th Corps was opposite that line. And Burnside did not have a good solid plan. Instead, he had his division commanders draw straws or, sticks to see who would go first. Even though the Hinks division of United States colored troops were the most rested, the best trained, and men, they were not allowed to go forward. And there was some political reason for that. If they would have met defeat and had been slaughtered, it would look like that we didn't care about them and were letting them become cannon fodder. And so they were denied the right to go first. And the worst commander in the 9th Corps drew the drew the stick, the longest stick, and therefore his men, he decided not even to go forward with them, and he was totally drunk in a bomb-proof behind the lines. And so those men, instead of going forward and crossing around the sides of the crater, they decided to go down in the crater, help the Confederates get out of the dirt, and then take souvenirs. And so reinforcements arrived after about an hour and fired down in and slaughtered those men. Eventually, the black regiments were unleashed, and they actually did what they were supposed to do, and they got the farthest, almost to the cemetery in Petersburg, when they were driven back because of reinforcements arriving. So that became a complete fiasco, and as a result, there was a court of inquiry, and General Burnside was relieved of his command. He was sent, he wasn't cashiered, but he was sent west, and we lose sight of him after that. So that's one incident, very regrettable incident. And eventually what's going to happen, we will come into April of 1865, and we devised, Grant and myself, and now General Ord, who's in command. Butler messed up royally at the Fort Fisher and other places. He was a political general, not a very good one. And we won't even talk about what he did in New Orleans when he was in command there. We decide that we will continue our pursuit of cutting the railroads, moving by the left flank. There's the Shenandoah campaign, which took place under General Sheridan. I won't get into our dispute with Sheridan. He was insubordinate. I probably should have shot him on the spot, but he eventually gets his own command. He's in the Shenandoah. The Shenandoah has been cleared, and the cavalry returns to our army, and they're going to make the advance on the left flank to Five Forks. And there's a great battle there, and we're successful, and the Confederates are defeated, and they have to pull back. Eventually, an opening, a weak link in the line after the Battle of Fort Stedman happens March 25th. The Confederates tried a suicide charge into our works. It didn't work again, and they were driven back. They were terribly weakened. General Gordon was in command of that. And we found a weak spot near the center line of the lines of Petersburg with the 6th Corps, and we drove through, and the line was broken by the Army of the Potomac. Grant was against that charge, but I was in favor of it and was successful. Lee now must flee west in order to continue the war. He tells the government in Richmond that he has to withdraw, and they better depart and leave because the city is now open. There's no defense. And he gathers his army and begins his headlong flight. He's trying to get to Danville, Virginia, where there are supplies waiting for him and a train connection to North Carolina, where he might, if he gets there, reach Johnston's army in North Carolina, reinforce that, bring the combined armies up to about 100,000, and maybe continue the war. That was the plan. We, on the other hand, had to pursue with 3 armies: the cavalry, the Army of the James on the left flank, and the Army of the Potomac directly behind Lee's army. And what happened was, of course, a rapid pursuit, and there were many fights, very significant fights all along the road toward Appomattox, until eventually we were able to pull Lee up enough that the cavalry got around into his rear. And then behind the cavalry came the infantry of the Army of the James. And so Lee tried to break out through the west. And the first line he saw were cavalry. He thought, oh, we'll break right through the cavalry. They can't stop us. And when the cavalry rode off to the flanks, he realized that he was facing the entire Army of the James, about 40,000 well-armed, well-equipped, and well-trained infantry, and he realized he couldn't go north because that's the river. He couldn't go south because that's the Army of the James and the cavalry. He couldn't go east because that was the Army of the Potomac. He had no choice, and he had to sue for peace or terms. So General Grant had been riding with me. We spent the night of April 8th, April 9th, in a home on the route to Appomattox, and we had breakfast together. We discussed the plans, and he said he's going to leave and ride around the Army to see Ord and Sheridan in the west. So he would be gone. He'd be on the trail, and I was very, very disappointed that he was leaving, because I realized wherever he was, that's where the action was going to be, because there were already flags of truce going through the lines with requests for terms and so on and so forth. And so I had no authority to stop. Grant said, keep pressing, keep pressing. I had no authority to call a ceasefire. And so when the message came through for begging for a meeting with Grant, of course he wasn't there, so I had to send it on to him by a rider following after him. Now I could have. Now this is conjecture, but Lee was helpless. His army was helpless. Had I obeyed orders and continued to charge forward, I could have crushed the Confederate Army and been the hero of Appomattox, and have ended the war right there if I wished. But I looked out and I saw helpless army, helpless enemy, my own men who wanted to get home after all the bloodshed, and therefore I held back on my own initiative and allowed the negotiations to go on. But many people don't know that. Had I been another commander, I may have been able to end the war right then and there. But I'm a man of peace, a man of Christian, gentleman, and I just saw no purpose in spilling blood just for my own career. And so Appomattox does take place. I wasn't present. Could I have been present? Oh, sure. Could General Grant have asked Lee to have a truce, to send me through the lines to join him? Could he have done that? Absolutely, he could have done that. Did he? No. So who did he have with them? He had Sheridan, Ord, and no commanders from the Army of the Potomac. And there were many eyebrows that were raised about that. Not me, because I only wanted to end the war and get home. So the formal surrender takes place on April the 12th, of course. And that is not ending the war. I mean, there's still Confederate armies in the field. I do want to tell you that eventually they are going to negotiate and fall one by one until finally the last battle of the Civil War takes place in Texas at Palmetto Ranch, early May of 1865. And believe it or not, it was a Confederate victory, but it was too late, and the war will end. Now, let me talk about my post-war career very quickly. We received orders to begin to march back north towards Washington, the entire Army of the Potomac. I had my head at the head, and of course, we passed through Richmond, and I received a note from General Lee, who was there after the surrender with his invalid wife, and he wanted to see me again. We had met briefly in his camp after the surrender, and we spent a very pleasant afternoon, and we talked about his career and what he saw for the future and so on. It was very, very nice. I enjoyed it. And then, of course, I'm back with my troops, and we eventually reached the Colorado Heights. We reached the outskirts of Washington, and we bed the army down because there's preparations for a great victory parade, which is called the Grand Review. Will take place over 2 days, May 23rd, May 24th, 1865. The Army of the Potomac on May 23rd, the Army of the West, that is the Western Army, Army of Tennessee, Cumberland, Ohio, on the 24th. Sherman chooses to take his bummers along with him, animals and packet and so on and so forth, and it was quite a display. I marched at the head of my troops. I was very proud. We stopped in front of the reviewing stand. Of course, President Lincoln had been assassinated. It was President Johnson. I was received into the reviewing stand. General Grant was there. General Sherman was there. My family was there, and of course, all the politicos. And I was very, very proud when the Army of the Potomac marched by. and then out of town back to their camps. And we began the process of mustering the armies out. That will take the rest of May, June, and into July. And I oversaw the disbandment of my own army. Paperwork had to be done, muster rolls had to be filled out, supplies had to be served, and of course, equipment had to be turned in. It was very, very burdensome task. On June the 10th, 1865, I returned to Philadelphia, my hometown, for a great victory parade. Unfortunately, it rained, but I was in command of the troops as we marched down Broad Street and then Market Street. Many of the men who had returned home came out for the parade. They were carrying their banners in the parade, and we were feted by the city of Philadelphia, and I was very proud. And then returned to my work, and at the conclusion of the war, the government broke the country up into military districts. They still do. And there would be a military command which would be in charge of the troops and facilities and camps and so on in that particular district. So I was ranked third in seniority. Grant number 1, Sherman number 2, Meade number 3. I was third in command. And so I had a pick of assignments. And therefore I looked at the divisions and I said, oh, this division is the division of the Atlantic. That's Pennsylvania, that's New York, that's New Jersey, etc. Can I have that district? They said, oh, yes, of course, General, certainly. And he said, where do you want to put your headquarters? And they said, well, generally it's in New York on Governor's Island. And I said, well, can I put the headquarters in Philadelphia? They said, sure, of course you can. So I chose to have my headquarters in my hometown where I could live in my home with my family, walk to work, and still be in command of the division of the Atlantic. And that I was very pleased with that. And however, I will get engaged in several incidents in the post-war period that I didn't enjoy very much, but it was my duty. I will briefly recount that. I don't know how I'm doing time-wise. Say another 5 minutes, Michael. And so number 1 was the Fenian invasion of Canada. Now, the Fenians, you might call them the IRA. They were Irish revolutionaries, and many of them had fought in the Union Army and were trained veteran soldiers, and they had taken their weapons home with them. They had blue uniforms. There were 2 armies, one in Maine, Eastport, Maine, and one on the Niagara frontier. And they were commanded by former officers of the Union Army. Thomas Sweeney, one-armed Thomas Sweeney, an Irishman, probably a total of 10,000 men, well-armed. And in fact, in Eastport, Maine, that's in my division, I sent a gunship down the St. Lawrence to prevent arms being shipped down, and they quickly dispersed. But on the Niagara frontier, they actually invaded Canada, then a part of the United Kingdom, and they fought a battle at Lime Ridge against the Canadian militia and won. But they fell back and they returned to American soil. And so I received a telegram from President Johnson, and he said, Meade, you have to help me. Great Britain has threatened war because they think that our army invaded Canada and fought a battle. You know, we have a history of trying to annex Canada. I guess you know that, all of you good Englishmen. And so I was sent essentially alone. I had a small staff. I rode the trains up to the Niagara frontier. I did have a small contingent of troops. The first thing I did was I arrested the commanders, General Sweeney and others, so they had no leaders. And then I talked to the railroads, and I had arranged that the men, the Fenians who were there, should all get free rides on the trains, courtesy of the government. That was arranged. And I called a great meeting of the Fenians. And I said, men, we shared the last drop from our canteens. You fought bravely in the wars for the Union. You're brave men. You have, honored your ancestry, etc. But guess it's now time to go home. You all want to go home, don't you? And they all shouted, yes, yes. I said, well, in anticipation of that, I have free rides on the train. So go get on the trains and go home and live a nice life. And they all shouted, jumped on the trains, and went home. And that was the end of the Fenian Rebellion. So I was invited by the High Commissioner of Canada to a banquet after this episode. And during that episode, he proclaimed me the savior of Canada. So since I was the savior of the Union at Gettysburg, that meant that I was the savior of the United States and the savior of Canada. That's not too bad for an old broken down engineer. Well, then, of course, we had political duties to do. And there was a lot of turmoil, controversy, and tragedy in the South, particularly in Georgia, South Carolina, that area. And the governor, military governor is General Pope, and he was a very strict radical Republican, and people didn't like him. And so President Johnson said, Meade, I'm sending you as governor of the South to Atlanta. And I hate politics. I am not a politician. I never wanted to be involved in politics, but this was an order from the president I couldn't decline. And so I went and I spent 1 year in Georgia during some of the most tumultuous problems of Reconstruction and of race hatred and baiting and conflict and disloyalty and lawlessness. And it was just horrible. I did the best I could with a even-handed approach. I honored my opponents in the war. I helped them fund the rebuilding of the Episcopal Church in Atlanta. I did other things to try to ameliorate some of the bitterness. And I always was glad that Georgia was the first former Confederate state that was allowed back in Congress because they ratified all the new amendments to the Constitution and they took their seats in Congress. And I'd like to take some claim for that, although I hated the duty. And then, of course, there was a great controversy when Grant ran for president in 1868, won, and of course, he only resigned his commission the day before he was sworn in. And so there was a lot of talk about, well, who was going to take over? Well, it was no controversy. It was Sherman. Sherman took over the rank of general. That's 4 stars. And that left the rank of lieutenant general open. And by right, since I was third in seniority, I was, according to Army tradition, I would step into that rank. And lo and behold, I read the newspaper and it said, Sheridan promoted lieutenant general. And I was brokenhearted, not because I was insulted. It was just my right for all that I had done for Grant. I had kept my mouth shut. I obeyed orders. I did everything he asked of me. I helped him as much as I could. And suddenly he goes over my head. And I went to see him as president. And I said, how could you do this? And he said, oh, I always thought that I had put Sheridan in third place. Sorry. And so he was no help whatsoever. And so General Sherman took pity on me, and he sent me back to the Division of the Atlantic, headquartered in Philadelphia. So starting in 1869, I was in Philadelphia with my family, my beloved family, and I got involved in much of the city civic affairs. I founded two schools for the orphans of my veterans. I also got involved in civic things like the opera and so on, and then veterans affairs. So I would always show up for the dedication of monuments and cemeteries and so on, and the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in Philadelphia in 1871, and so on. And so I was, plus the city decided that it was going to lay out a city park known as Fairmount Park. And I was picked to be the first commissioner of the park. They wanted me to be president of the commission. I said, no, I'm still an active Army officer, and I just don't have the time, and I have to go away at certain times, etc., serve on boards and court martials and this sort of thing. So I said, I'll be vice president. And my very, very dear friend, Morton McMichael, one of the founders of the Union League, became the president. But I was given the task as an engineer to lay out the park and its roads and other kinds of features. And so old Baldy, on his loyal back, I would ride around and draw maps and so on and map out Fairmount Park, which still exists to this day, still the same roads, still my engineering prowess, and that's where my memorial is located, which nobody goes to see because they don't know about it, unfortunately, but Dave Bradley will when he visits Philadelphia in the summer. So I was wounded very severely. I talked about that. Shot through the lungs and the liver at the Battle of Glendale, almost killed. I was 46 years old at the time, 47, and now I'm 56 years old, and I'm very susceptible to respiratory illnesses. Constant bouts of pneumonia and bronchitis and so on, brought on by my severe wound, and particularly pneumonia. And I was able to fight off these, my tough condition, inured over several wars and service in the very, very disagreeable climes and locations. But in October 31st, 1872, I came down with a case of pneumonia. I went into my bed in my home. Well, actually, it's my wife's home. She lets me live there. 1836 Delancey Place. The building still stands. And there I will die of pneumonia on November the 6th, 1872.